Okay, thank you for the presentations. I now would like to invite our speakers to turn on your mics and cameras so we can start the conversation, the Q&A. I do like to encourage our attendees to type in your questions, to take up this opportunity to ask our two speakers. There's no stupid question. Again, we are here to learn together. While you are thinking of your questions, I can just throw in some questions that are prepared or submitted by the C2G team to get the conversation going. First of all, there are a lot of information. There's a lot of information there. Can we just review why it's important to talk about large-scale carbon dioxide removal, CDR, and the need for governance? Why now? So you both have touched this question in your presentations, but can you give us the top lines again to frame our conversation? Perhaps I can start with Sabine.
Yes, thank you for this question. It's actually a good one because it was really a flood of information that was pouring down on the audience. So it's probably good to go back to the sort of key facts. So I think with respect to your questions, two elements are really outstanding there. One is that we really facing a shrinking time window, and I think those pathways and also the graphics that were visible in Claire's presentation showed very much how each year that we emit another 40 gigatons of CO2, we're sort of shrinking our carbon budget and nearing a pathway where we will actually overshoot our temperature goal. And this is actually what the society, the community has decided they don't want. They don't want to accept those incremental impacts. So it looks like we're making ourselves more and more dependent on CDR. And we have to have a debate on that. We have to have a debate on how much we want to make ourselves dependent on CDR. And if so, how we actually want to tackle this. So not only how much CDR we want, but also which kind of technologies we're prepared to ramp up. And this is actually the second element, ramping up. So this will actually take a while. So the decisions that we are making now will actually form our strategy in the time to come. So this is why it's important to have that discussion now, even if in the pathways where you often look at net emissions, the problem seems to be a little bit farther away, but indeed it's actually not.
Okay, thank you, Sabine. Claire, do you want to share your thoughts?
I mean, I think Sabine kind of covered that really nicely. I guess the only thing I would add is really the dangers of going above 1.5 degrees. And I think we've got very clear science from that, from the IPCC, on the potential for irreversible climate impacts to happen, for tipping points to be passed. And so that is where, as Sabine said, that we're kind of, it's a dangerous game that we're in, and we need to be prepared to do everything that we can to prevent going over that 1.5 limit. And unfortunately, now we've got to the point where carbon removal is going to have to be a part of that, but we still don't know kind of what scale, how much we will need, and that really depends on what we do in the next decade or so.
Thank you both for reviewing and highlighting this important issue. And I hope that our participants will take this messages away from the conversation today. And then let's move on to the second question prepared by C2G, according to you, which approaches to CDR offer most promise, and under which circumstance? Does this assessment change if we make good progress on emission reductions? Anyone want to give it a try?
Well, yeah, maybe if I start and then Claire can maybe fill also in on the governance challenges. My perception is that what came forth from my presentation is that there are a couple of options, practices, approaches. It's sometimes difficult to talk about afforestation as technology that we already have some experience with, right? Where we're sort of applying that, and this seems to be something that we can go more readily forward with because of the level of experience that we have, but also because you saw that these were lower on the cost spectrum side. Now we've heard also in Claire's presentation that a lot of these, of course, suffer from concerns about permanence, disturbances that will happen more under ongoing climate change. So I think a robust strategy would be to not discard the other eggs in the basket and to also look into other ways to store CO2 more permanently. But I think it could be a good entry point also because, and then Claire can fill in on this, it feels that we already collected a little bit of knowledge on governance problems, for instance, in the frame of REDD+. And it seems that in terms of public acceptance and the viewpoints of different actors, it seems to be a not so difficult topic compared to some of the pathways that involve geological storage. But yeah, maybe Claire wants to have a more qualified input on the governance issues.
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, you've covered it pretty well. Yeah, I guess I would agree that I think the more kind of nature-based approaches certainly receive sort of higher levels of public acceptability and are associated more obviously with co-benefits for example, for biodiversity and for local populations. And as Sabine said, we've got experience from REDD+ and other kind of forest governance, payment ecosystem services systems that we can draw from, although these have also highlighted the challenge of using nature-based solutions, in particular in developing countries that often face capacity constraints with respect to monitoring the carbon flows within these ecosystems and ensuring that these any areas that we restore or protect remain protected and restored into the longer term. And especially that becomes a challenge with future climate change impacts. We know that as temperatures rise, a lot of these ecosystems will become increasingly vulnerable to reversals of their carbon storage through, for example, forest fires or more intense storms. And so that presents, I think, a significant challenge. And that's, yeah, again, I would agree with Sabine that we need to kind of keep all of our options open by also pursuing these more novel options that are perhaps less ready, and in terms of both technology, but also governance systems. They'll require very different governance systems. They'll also need to be kind of brought into the context of the energy system that we have. So, for example, for direct air capture and for bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, both of these will have to operate within the energy system and within the food system as well, in the case of bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. So it's all very context dependent. And yeah, I think all avenues really do need to be pursued so that we can understand which options will suit which contexts and which scales the best.
Okay, thank you. Both of you mentioned certain important and interesting issues, in particular in nature-based solutions. I would like to come back to that point later on. But here we have received a question from Greg, which is directed to Sabine about scenarios. Yeah, so this question is the IPCC 1.5 report relied on Sabine review for its assessment of realistic and sustainable potential of various CDR options. But more than half of the pathways the special report 1.5 used had BECS higher than the upper end of Sabine's potential range. Presumably that's because the relevant IAM modelers weren't looking so much at the detail of CDR potential? Very technical question. Do you see this anomaly being addressed in the future upcoming AR6?
So first of all, just to clarify that I'm not serving as an author on AR6, but I did serve as an author on a special report on 1.5 degrees C, and there I could already observe that this is changing a little. So two things. So one thing Greg mentioned himself is, of course, that what I was doing was a review. So all these studies had been around for other peoples, including IAM modelers to read and consult, and already in that generation of scenarios that was reviewed for the or assessed for the SR 1.5, we could see that it was partially taken on board. So, for example, like one thing was that the scenario spectrum got wider. So previously we saw a lot of pathways that had partially overshoot, but that were withdrawing a lot of CO2 in the second half of the century. Now we actually had a couple of pathways, and I think this literature still needs to be growing, but already in that report there were a couple of pathways that were really trying to do without CDR, or where they had to remove some, to do so with natural climate solutions. So afforestation was very prevalent there, and other techniques in the land use sector. But in principle, this attempt to also reap mitigation potentials on the demand side, and trying to reduce the dependence on CDR. So that is, I think, the first positive sign. So this widening of the pathway spectrum that we didn't really see so much before. The other development I observed in the modeling community was that with increasing knowledge about the different options, IAM modelers started to also integrate other options than BECS. So for that report, this literature was still sparse, of course, but more and more of the models were starting to integrate also direct air carbon capture and storage. I already mentioned the land use options in the agricultural sector, most of all, of course, afforestation. So bit by bit, we see improvements on both ends. And I think that's a very good step into the right direction of sort of bringing together what the bottom-up literature finds to be sustainable and what we actually see playing out in the global pathways. But it's a very good question. It's something I've been thinking about a lot myself.
Thank you, Sabine. And so, yeah, it's interesting. The substance of the IPCC reports is largely depending on the available literature resources, right? Yeah. Which is progressing with time. Thank you for that. And I'd like to bring back to the one of the issues you both mentioned in your presentation and also the previous discussion on land-based use, land sector, and also nature-based solutions Claire just mentioned. Here, I have a terminology question here, which we think, C2G think is important to particular governance discussions, right? And how we frame CDR impact, the governance discussions. And I would like to know your thoughts on the most helpful ways of framing CDR and different categories of CDR approaches, and what are the terms you use to talk about nature-based approaches or solutions, for instance. Wants to start?
Yeah, I can have a start, just to say that nature-based solutions, for me, how I use the term, is actually bigger than just removing CO2. It could also be avoided deforestation, for instance. But I'm totally aware that different groups and even different groups within the scientific community have different uses of terminology, and natural climate solution, nature-based solutions, and so on. Sometimes gets a little bit confounded. But I think it's in this context important to talk about nature-based solutions beyond carbon removal as well, because of course it's always preferable to have that pristine primary forest still intact and there, because we're not only talking about carbon but also other ecosystem services. In that sense, I think it's useful to have a sort of nature-based perspective when talking about natural climate solutions, and to not only think about the sort of maximizing the removal that we can get out of something. And then in terms of the debate and different communities, what you were alluding to, I think I do see a tendency to sort of have a discussion that that separates removals that come naturally and removals that come through technologies. And I'm not sure personally whether that's always so helpful, because it tends to sort of narrow down our view. And I think it's important to keep in mind what are you actually after, right? If for instance you're concerned about the land footprint of BECCS, then replacing that removal gap by large scale monoculture afforestation might not be what you sort of have in mind. This will also take up a lot of land. This might also not be the big synergy with biodiversity protection that you have in mind. So I think it's more useful to sort of formulate what kind of objectives we're after, and to sort of think about the removal options in that respect, than to really sort of separate them out and sort of pin them against each other on the basis of a two-sided categorization. But that's my very personal view, and also, of course, biased by the way and by the kind of discussions that I'm involved in.
Great. Thank you, Sabine. Claire, do you want to share some of your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think Sabine made some really important points there. And I think in particular, I think the case of afforestation illustrates quite well the challenge with terminology, because it is often classed as being a nature-based solution, and in many cases the type of afforestation that you might do with large-scale monocultures, replacing, say, natural grassland, which is itself a very good store of carbon and place for biodiversity. I think that's it's something that we really need to be aware of in the messaging of carbon removal, that not all nature-based solutions are kind of equal in terms of their co-benefits for other issues, and also their carbon storage capacity. And I think I would agree with Sabine that, like, the challenge of kind of splitting out different carbon removal options is that you might end up with a lot of people kind of going for the ones that sound nicest, so the nature-based ones, which tend to be the cheapest. They're often the lowest hanging fruits, often in developing countries where there are these really specific governance challenges. But we really also need to have investment going into developing the more expensive, the more challenging options. And so, I don't really know what the right answer is in that one, but I guess these are issues to be aware of whichever way we go, what effect is it going to have on, I guess, where the interest and the investment and the kind of governance focus goes.
Okay. I want us to dig further a little bit around nature-based solution on land sector. You both touched on in your presentations. Both of you mentioned, we need a broader perspective, looking at SDG perspective, SDG Sustainable Development Goals. So how do you think that could be happening? We should not only focus on carbon climate goals, but also look at biodiversity and use food security, etc. How do you think that could be happening at international level and the domestic level?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of precedents that we might actually be able to learn from. So Claire was earlier on mentioning REDD+, reduced emissions from deforestation and degradation. And this was also mainly targeted to compensate, for instance, tropical countries for the opportunity cost of actually keeping the forest intact and not expanding into the forests as agricultural areas were developing. So, but then this broader concern for other SDGs and so on got in, and that resulted in more negotiations and in the building in and integration of these sustainability safeguards that were sort of trying to have a broader base for this. Other precedents, for instance, coming from Europe. I've observed a little bit the how it's been going with bioenergy, biofuels. So there also the concern was that, okay, if we substitute fossil fuels, biofuels for fossil fuels, but we import a lot of biomass from abroad and are causing maybe land use change there and threats to biodiversity, how can we actually come up for that? And that actually led to an update of the Renewable Energy Directive to also build in certain sustainability safeguards. Other options is maybe not necessarily through policy, but also actions that pertain to certification, for instance, where it's actually the consumer that can actually, through his or her purchasing, options make clear what the for instance wood or other products come from, even though with some of the different CDR pathways that's more difficult to see, but at other levels maybe that could be also an entry point. And then fourth, I would say it could actually be also an entry point. I mean, missing often the incentives to remove CO2 in the first place, it might be closer to some actors to actually finance the preservation of a typical forest, for instance, for its value for the contained biodiversity or other things. So I think, yes, in the realm of avoiding deforestation, biofuels, and so on, maybe there are a couple of things to be learned from how these broader SDG criteria can be built in. But there's definitely a lot of work and a lot of governance gaps that Claire also pointed to that we need to think about if we want to do this properly.
Right, Claire. Do you want to share some additional thoughts?
I think that was pretty comprehensive, really. I guess just one very small point on the last part of what Sabine said is this idea of I guess when planning a project, being cognizant of all of the impacts that project will have, and in some cases you might actually be designing a project, say, for adaptation purposes or for conservation purposes. And I guess that's where you might have carbon removal as a secondary benefit, but I don't think we should shift. It shouldn't necessarily always be the primary objective. I think that's a really important point, and I think sometimes we can get distracted by just the need to remove carbon. But actually, in some contexts, the more important element is say the adaptation or the biodiversity benefit. So I think it's going to be a big challenge, I think, to weigh up all of these benefits and decide how to optimize a project so that it does the right thing for that community, as well as contributing to sort of global challenges.
Yeah, and I may also add that, of course, what I've been saying has been a little bit biased by a lot of the literature being focused really on the side effects of anything to do with biomass, with afforestation and so on. But the literature on side effects of large-scale implementation of direct air carbon capture and storage and so on is actually still nascent. So there might also be challenges in there that we don't really address yet, just because it's not being captured by the assessments that rely on on peer-reviewed literature. But that doesn't mean that there couldn't be a potential problem there as well, right? So yeah, I'm absolutely on the one page with Claire saying that projects should be planned cognizant of CO2 removal, sometimes being maybe the side effect in the land sector.
Right. I think both of you also touch on the incentives, the finance point. Then I would like to ask a question on this point. So Claire, you mentioned that incentives to accelerate research, drive investment and implementation are needed, and that we should identify no regret options. Can we hear more about what this look like?
Sorry, you mean what the investments look like, or what the incentives look like?
The incentives, yeah, sorry, incentives.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a big question, which I definitely can't answer comprehensively. Maybe Sabine can help me afterwards. I guess one element that I think is really important for, encouraging incentives is to have the overarching governance architecture that we have of the Paris Agreement, and of having these national targets to limit warming sufficiently to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, because I think that really forms the framework for where we're going. And no one would invest in carbon removal unless we really had to do it, right? And so having this global direction of where we're going towards 1.5 is really important for because it forces governments to confront the fact that they will need negative emissions in the future, and they need to come up with ideas of how to get there. And actually a lot of countries now coming forward with long-term strategies under the Paris Agreement for how they will get to low emissions development are considering negative emissions. And so I think that is then itself a really important point on the way to then for those governments to then look into how to incentivize it, whether that be through public research programs or public-private cooperation. And then on the other hand, you have companies also coming forward. A number of companies have come forward with net zero targets, or even in some cases to go net negative. And so that itself means that they will need to look into what negative emissions technologies they can either invest in their own supply chains, or maybe they can contribute to negative emissions outside of their supply chain by funding projects elsewhere. So yeah, I guess that is to me the kind of fundamental piece of the jigsaw for incentives, is to have this everyone kind of tracking in the same direction, knowing that we need to go to net zero and maybe ultimately net negative. And yeah, is that enough?
Thank you, Claire. Sabine?
No, I think Claire actually covered this already quite nicely. I have only two small ideas on the question of sources of finance. So one is, of course, that as long as we have residual emissions, we also have something that we can generate tax revenue on, that we can use actually to finance, basically to clean each ton that is still emitted can sort of pay for its own removal in the end. If we go net negative, that looks different, of course. But the other idea I had is actually inspired by something that Climate Analytics put out today, where actually there is a lot of money being put on the table right now by a lot of governments in order to get economies up and running in the aftermath of the lockdowns associated with the COVID pandemic. And I think it would be, a lot of countries are trying to sort of make those recovery packages green. But I think there is some scope to go a little bit more deeply into that. So these would be my small additions to this.
Thank you, Sabine, for sharing your thoughts as well. So just a reminder, we are close to the end of this session. If any of participants really has a burning question, and do throw in. Otherwise, I will just close after shortly. Let me just perhaps give you one last question here from us, from C2G. On governance. Sabine, you close your presentation with a statement saying good governance needed to include the necessary deliberation processes. Claire, you also mentioned stakeholder engagement as well. Can we hear more about what those processes could look like? Please.
Yes, so I mainly put that point to sort of say that ultimately it won't be us scientists that tell basically the world which pathway they should be going down on. Basically, the only thing that we can do is like show which pathways lead to 1.5 degrees and sort of show what kind of trade-offs and challenges and also opportunities they come with. And having put that on the table, I think it then needs to be society that decides which pathway they want to go down, how much CO2 they want, and which type of CO2 removal they want to see. And I think the first step, and that's related also to the question that just came up in the Q&A box by Greg. Part of this is, of course, has been going through the IPCC process to the special report. So policymakers are getting more aware of this. But what I meant is also going a little bit wider, because we might actually have good solutions and nice solutions, but then if we don't get the acceptance for this from society, then this might actually prove an infeasible pathway. So I think we need to think more about formats, dialogue formats, bringing people, representatives from all different actor groups to the table, involving more than policymakers, but also involving business, as Claire was saying, people from NGOs, people from the public, and so on. And I think more of these formats are emerging. But I think we need a lot more of this in this context, because often it doesn't go as far as removal. I perceive carbon dioxide removal still to be a little bit of a side discussion, and as long as it doesn't enter really the consciousness of people, that we will have to think about this, and relatively soon, in order to make it happen or not. We need more of those. But actually, since Claire also pointed to that in the governance challenges, she might also have some additional ideas here.
Thank you, Sabine. And also you have addressed Craig's question, excellent question. I would like to ask you as well. Yeah, maybe Claire, you can combine these answers together as well, and to address Craig's question, please.
Yeah, which is a very good question. I guess one thing I was going to add on this public acceptance point, which I think is really important. I think we've seen in sort of the UK case, for example, where there was a recent climate assembly, and one of the results was people actually aren't very keen on sort of anything that involves carbon capture, for example. And there was a recent paper by Emily Cox who looked at perceptions of carbon removal in the UK and the US. And she showed that when the discourse is around climate urgency and the real need to do something very quickly, and the kind of looming threat of climate change, carbon removal really didn't appeal to people, because it doesn't seem like an urgent solution. It seems like a delay tactic. And it doesn't also conform with what people think of as being the future that they kind of dream of. You know, it's one nice way of talking about climate change is to think about, like, what do you see for the future? And you can imagine, like, clean cities, like quiet, clean cars, and good public transport, and low air pollution. And I think a challenge with some types of carbon removal is it doesn't necessarily conform to those ideas. And so I think this is something that I guess scientists and NGOs and all sorts of communities will have to work on, this messaging of CDR being part of the solution, and ways to ensure that we're comfortable that governments and companies and all stakeholders are also doing their part to reduce emissions and to put us onto that sustainable kind of nice vision of a sustainable low carbon future. And related to that, I think, so partly in answer to Greg's question, I think this is where thinking about alternative ways to frame net zero is important as well. So maybe thinking about separate targets for emissions versus removals, because net zero can somehow conceal what needs to be done. We don't necessarily know how many emissions are left in the system and how many removals are being assumed that we're going to have to rely on. And so I think kind of full transparency from anyone that has a target on what they're going to do with their emissions and whether that is compatible with 1.5, and then how many removals they'll have to do as a result. I think that would be quite helpful for moving past this idea that carbon removal is just a delay tactic. So that's my thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, getting back to what Greg was saying, I think building on what Claire was just saying, this is exactly how I perceive this move in the UK for the separate targets, to really say, okay, actually we do here. This is not the magic bullet, and we keep it apart and will not interfere with mitigation. So it's a good example of a first step into the direction that Greg would like to see, I think.
Excellent. Thank you for your thoughts, and also open some very interesting topics. And I wish that we could explore further in the next session in EMS also. So with that, we are running out of time. I'd like to bring our discussions close to a close. I hope it has been an insightful and useful discussion for you, and as it has been for us. You can find further resources on this topic and other topics on our website, C2G2.net, by signing up for our newsletter. Please complete the post-event survey to help us improve our future events. Lastly, I would like to say a huge thank you to our two distinguished experts and to my colleagues who are here today. And finally, to all of you who have participated in this webinar. These are important discussions, and they do highlight how critically important it is for us to bring forward the governance discussions and address the governance gaps. And apparently, there's a lot of work ahead. So with that said, I would like to close today's webinar and wish you an enjoyable weekend. Bye-bye.